Mayday, TACA 110. We lost an engine. I understand you have lost an engine, is that correct? Both engines, sir. Both engines.
Just over an hour after takeoff, this Boeing 737 unexpectedly flew into a powerful storm. Torrential rain poured down like a waterfall, pounding violently against the windshield. At the same time, hailstones slammed into the aircraft. Then something terrifying happened. The engine caught fire and exploded, causing a total loss of thrust. Facing this life-or-death crisis, the crew was forced to make a bold decision: attempt an emergency landing on a narrow canal. But just at the last moment, an unexpected situation occurred. What would be the fate of this aircraft? Let's dive into the story of Central American Airways Flight 110. May 24, 1988, Philip S.W. Goldson International Airport, Belize. A Boeing 737 had just landed and was taxiing to its assigned gate, awaiting clearance for departure. The aircraft was designated Central American Airways Flight 110, operating a scheduled route from San Salvador, El Salvador, with a stopover in Belize before heading to New Orleans, Louisiana, USA. The aircraft, a Boeing 737-300, had only been delivered 2 weeks prior, virtually brand new. There were 38 passengers on board that day, mostly citizens of El Salvador and the United States. The 7-member crew included 3 pilots and 4 flight attendants. Commanding the flight was 29-year-old Captain Carlos Dardano. Despite his young age, he had already accumulated an astonishing 13,410 flight hours, including 11,000 hours as captain. In the airline, he was seen as a legendary figure. During the height of the El Salvador Civil War in 1985, he had been shot in the face by guerrilla fire while piloting a Douglas aircraft. Although seriously wounded, he remained conscious and successfully crash-landed the plane, saving everyone on board. The injury left him permanently blind in his left eye, but he refused to give up his flying career. After intense retraining and rigorous evaluations, he proved his skills to the FAA and regained his flying license. Also in the cockpit was First Officer Dionisio Lopez, 48, with over 12,000 hours of flying experience, and Czech pilot Arturo Solas, who was on board to evaluate the performance of this newly delivered aircraft and ensure compliance with all safety regulations. At 11:05 a.m. local time, Flight 110 was cleared for takeoff. Within a minute, it lifted off the runway and climbed into the sky. The flight plan would take it over the Gulf of Mexico, across the Louisiana coast, and finally land in New Orleans, Louisiana. The total flight time was expected to be around 2 hours. Weather conditions were favorable at first. The aircraft climbed smoothly to a cruising altitude of 35,000 feet, and the first hour of flight was uneventful. But at 12:24 p.m., as the plane entered southern U.S. airspace, the pilots noticed the weather ahead worsening. They switched to Instrument Flight Rules, IFR, relying solely on instruments rather than visual cues. They also requested permission to descend to avoid flying directly into the thick clouds and storm systems. In the U.S. South, especially near the coast, weather can change rapidly, with violent thunderstorms, hail, lightning, and strong gusts forming in minutes. To prepare, the crew activated the onboard weather radar, a tool used to detect storm cells. The radar displayed green for light turbulence, yellow for moderate disturbance, red for severe weather, areas to avoid. However, in some extreme cases, weather radar has limitations. When storms are extremely intense, the radar signal can be completely absorbed, creating what's known as a radar shadow, a blank area on the screen. This may mislead pilots into thinking it's a safe path, when in fact it could be the very heart of the storm. Back on Central American Airways Flight 110, the aircraft had now descended to 30,000 feet, entering a thick cloud layer. Realizing that the weather was worsening, the flight crew quickly activated the continuous ignition system and anti-icing systems in an attempt to protect the engines from hail and ice buildup. After analyzing the radar, the captain spotted what appeared to be a narrow gap between two massive red storm zones. He made a calculated decision to steer the aircraft toward that gap, hoping to safely pass through the dangerous area. The Boeing 737 cautiously navigated through the dense cloud cover, but the crew was unaware that what looked like a safe gap was actually a radar blind spot, the core of a massive supercell thunderstorm invisible on their screens. At 12:40 p.m. local time, a Category 4 thunderstorm suddenly emerged directly ahead of the aircraft. Lightning ripped through the sky and struck the Boeing jet. Torrential rain poured like a waterfall, and violent winds pounded the fuselage. The plane began shaking violently, nearly spinning out of control. As the plane descended to 25,000 feet, it was suddenly hit by a severe hailstorm. Hailstones the size of golf balls pummeled the windshield and engines like cannonballs. The loud, sharp clang of metal being struck echoed through the cabin. Inside the cockpit, the crew was briefly stunned, but quickly regained composure. They reduced speed to lessen stress on the airframe and continued descending, hoping to escape the storm before they lost control. But when the aircraft reached 16,500 feet, the pilot's worst nightmare became reality. All warning alarms in the cockpit suddenly blared. Both CFM56 engines had flamed out. The aircraft had lost all thrust. No power, no hydraulics, no auxiliary systems. In that moment, the Boeing 737 became a 47-ton glider. Every minute, the plane was losing approximately 1,500 feet of altitude. In 1988, a total engine failure on a modern aircraft like this was virtually unthinkable. There was no specific procedure in the flight manual to handle this kind of emergency. The crew knew only their skill, training, and sheer willpower could save the plane, and everyone on board. The check pilot immediately started the Auxiliary Power Unit, APU, a small engine normally used on the ground, but in emergencies it could provide just enough electrical and hydraulic power to keep essential systems running. Meanwhile, the first officer quickly established emergency communications with air traffic control. And the captain, despite having vision in only one eye, remained calm and focused. He gripped the controls firmly, guiding the crippled aircraft through the storm, searching for any glimmer of hope. At 10,500 feet, the APU successfully came online. Power returned. Hydraulic systems, flight instruments, and radio communications were restored. The crew once again had basic control of the aircraft. Most importantly, they now had enough power to attempt an engine restart. Following the captain's calm instructions, the crew began the engine restart procedure. Tension filled the cockpit like a stretched wire. All eyes were locked on the control panel. Engine number 1 came back to life, slowly spinning up. Moments later, engine number 2 also restarted. For the first time since disaster struck, the crew saw a ray of hope. But that hope was short-lived. Further system checks revealed a shocking truth. Both engines were running only at idle speed, producing almost no usable thrust. Worse still, engine number 2 was overheating rapidly. Even the slightest increase in throttle risked a catastrophic engine explosion. Faced with no viable alternative, the captain made a difficult decision: to shut down both engines again. It was a painful choice, but the only way to prevent an even greater disaster. This also meant confronting the undeniable reality: Flight 110 would not make it to New Orleans. Understanding the growing urgency, the first officer sent out a Mayday distress call to air traffic control. And the captain, despite having vision in only one eye, remained calm and focused. He gripped the controls firmly, guiding the crippled aircraft through the storm, searching for any glimmer of hope. At 10,500 feet, the APU successfully came online. Power returned. Hydraulic systems, flight instruments, and radio communications were restored. The crew once again had basic control of the aircraft. Most importantly, they now had enough power to attempt an engine restart. Following the captain's calm instructions, the crew began the engine restart procedure. Tension filled the cockpit like a stretched wire. All eyes were locked on the control panel. Understanding the growing urgency, the first officer sent out a Mayday distress call to air traffic control.
Mayday, TACA 110. We lost an engine. I understand you have lost an engine, is that correct? Both engines, sir. Both engines. Understand both engines. I'm the current emergency here. I don't have any engines, okay? Any engines. We glide them down, okay? Understand you're gliding down, TACA 110, roger.
Shortly afterward, air traffic control in New Orleans suggested an alternative. The crew could try to divert to Lakeland Airport, located about 17 kilometers from the aircraft's current position. The pilots requested a further descent, but they knew all too well, at their current speed and altitude loss, reaching Lakeland was impossible. Abandoning any hope of restarting the engines, the three pilots began scanning the terrain ahead for any possible place to attempt an emergency landing. Given their rapidly decreasing altitude and speed, no airport runway was within reach. They had no choice but to face a harsh reality. An emergency landing would have to take place in the flood-prone swamplands of Louisiana. As the aircraft emerged below the clouds, they finally saw the ground and spotted a wide drainage canal ahead. The crew immediately lowered the flaps and landing gear.
This is TACA 110. We are landing on the water.
This is TACA 110. We are landing on the water. Upon receiving the message, air traffic control alerted the Coast Guard and launched emergency rescue protocols. At around 5,000 feet, the pilots had a clear view of the terrain. Ahead lay a broad drainage area. The flaps and landing gear were fully deployed. The crew announced an emergency to the passengers, and the flight attendants instructed everyone to put on life vests, remove shoes, jewelry, or any sharp objects, assume the brace position for impact. At 1,500 feet, there was just about 1 minute left before touchdown. The captain extended the glide path to maximize distance and reduce speed. The first officer worked through the landing checklist to properly configure the aircraft for final approach. But at around 1,000 feet, the first officer spotted another possible landing site. To the right of the drainage canal, there was a long, narrow strip of grass, an artificial levee built to prevent river overflow during storm seasons. He quickly proposed the levee as an alternative landing site. The captain agreed without hesitation, banked the aircraft to the right, and adjusted the approach. This levee, however, was far narrower than any standard runway, and the wet, grassy surface was slippery and dangerous. Still, it was safer than ditching on water. Time was running out. They couldn't consider more options. The plane was still a bit too high, and the levee was only a few hundred meters away. They had to descend quickly. The captain pushed the nose down to lose altitude, reduced lift, and carefully managed airspeed to keep the approach stable. This levee was barely wide enough for a Boeing 737. Even the slightest deviation could spell disaster. The captain made a bold, unconventional maneuver, one usually reserved for gliders or small aircraft, almost never used for a jetliner. The plane's speed and altitude dropped rapidly. But the final approach presented another serious challenge. With only one functioning eye, the captain found it extremely difficult to judge height visually. To make things worse, a concrete barrier stood at the beginning of the levee, and on the right side was a steep drop into the canal. If they landed too early, they would hit the wall. If too late, they would overshoot the levee and crash. Flight 110 began its final descent. There was no engine power, no reverse thrust, just the braking system and the captain's skill. Then, the aircraft touched down smoothly on the levee, sliding along the grass and gradually slowing down. The plane came to a complete stop, safe. All 45 people on board survived. No one was seriously injured, except one passenger recovering from a recent appendectomy who experienced minor complications. The aircraft itself sustained only minor external damage, mainly to the nose and windshield due to hail. Flight 110 became one of the most miraculous landings in aviation history. The investigation, led by the U.S. National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB), revealed that the aircraft had unintentionally flown into the core of a Category 4 thunderstorm. Although the crew had activated all anti-icing systems, the intense hailstorm caused both engines to flame out and shut down completely. Externally, the cockpit windows and nose cone were damaged, but the rest of the fuselage remained largely intact. Following the NTSB's recommendations, engine manufacturer CFM International modified the CFM6 engine design, adding combustion sensors, redesigning fan blade spacing, and introducing an additional drainage system to reduce the risk of flameouts in severe weather. In the end, Central American Aircraft Flight 110 was recognized as one of the greatest feats of emergency piloting in aviation history.